Okay, so again, to close us out here, predatory control. This was kind of the original management technique, right? We went out and we shot a bunch of wolves and stuff. Now that we understand a little bit more about how the world works, it's pretty controversial, particularly for people outside of the ranching community. For ranchers, it's not controversial at all. They would just as well shoot any wolf they ever saw. And indeed, part of the reason that they're so kind of entrenched in that is that they're really the first people to really do it, right? It was part of their livelihood, particularly in the 19th century, but also in the 20th century as well, the early 20th century. And again, the idea, originally, we thought that all prey species were just kind of being held down by being eaten, right? And so we would shoot a bunch of predators so that there were more of the prey species, right? We do still use it a little bit for game management, right? But today, really, mostly what we use predator control for, we try to avoid it whenever we can. We use it today for threatened or endangered species, right? Where we really need to ease every possible pressure off them to get a population size back to a sustainable level. And once those animals come off the threatened or endangered species list, then the predator control mechanisms are usually removed as well. One thing that has changed a lot is we have added a lot of non-lethal means. Trapping and removal is a very, very popular way of predator control. So trapping them and taking them somewhere else is a big, big thing. With predator control, like every other management decision you ever make, you have to start by thinking about what your objectives are, right? What do you want to actually accomplish, and what is the best way to do that? And in addition to kind of being problematic from an ethical standpoint, with predator control, it's hard to really get a sense for what's actually going to happen, right? It goes back to the notion of whether we're talking about compensatory mortality or additive mortality. Are these animals just taking populations off of the sort of the above K mark, or are they artificially holding down, or artificially are they holding down prey population sizes below K? We don't know, right? We honestly don't know until we do it. Okay, so that's problematic. And beyond that, right, we have to remember that all of these ecosystem kinds of interactions, they're dynamic. And when you change one thing, another thing changes, right, to go with it. And making these sort of big sweeping ideas, especially something as final as shooting something, is problematic from that standpoint. Other practical factors go into it too, right? Is going out and shooting wolves really worth your time and money as a management technique? Maybe, I don't know. If you're gonna do it though, right, you really need to understand a couple of basic things, right? Again, we go back to compensatory or additive mortality. Are predators actually killing beyond what would normally be culled anyway, right? If the answer is yes, well then maybe predator control is an option. But if not, there's no reason to do it. You're just killing stuff for no good reason, right? Beyond that, right, will reduced predation mean that we'll give higher population sizes? Will we get harvests that are greater than we normally expect, right? Yes or no, okay? And one way to answer that is to say, well, are our game species fully utilizing their habitat, right? Are they at K, right? And that's not always the easiest thing to understand. That's actually often really tricky to try to model, honestly. We talk about carrying capacity in these things as sort of being, written in stone or whatever, but the reality of it is a lot of the stuff is kind of guesswork. Right? There's a lot of things that we can't or won't or didn't measure that can really affect that. And ultimately, like I said, I keep saying it, but it's always true. if you're already at K, killing off a bunch of predators is really not going to have much effect. At this point, what this is telling us, right, is that all predation, or at least most predation, is compensatory. It's not additive. It's not to say that it can never have a positive impact, right? If you're trying to grow a population, right, if the population is far below K, it can actually have a fairly positive impact on it, right? And one reason for that is that you go back to vulnerability, right? Young of year animals are very, very easy prey. And so if we don't have as many predators, more of these guys will survive until the next year. And it's these guys, the neonates, the young of year, that are going to be breeding next year. And so the larger your breeding population is, the larger the next year's neonate class is going to be. And so it can kind of expand outward exponentially from there. But if this is going to happen and be a multi-year kind of process, you have to go out and kill predators every year, right? Because again, remember, functional response, as you increase prey population sizes, predator populations will also increase from there, right? Now, remember though, these predators that you're killing aren't just killing the game species, right? They're also keeping down small mammal populations, so mice, rats, squirrels, nuisance species, okay? And these can be problematic for, communities nearby, right? They can also be problematic for other management activities because a lot of these animals have other impacts on important animals for us, right? They'll eat duck eggs. If you're worried about managing for duck populations, having a whole bunch of rodents kicking around that'll eat those eggs is not a positive outcome for you. If you've got a whole bunch of deer, right, or elk, they might overgraze. They might actually get to the point where they eat themselves out of house and home, and you can't increase the population size anyway, right? So there's lots of these sorts of unforeseen or unintentional consequences that can actually be pretty bad from removing predators. So again, with predator control, you really, really got to be sure. With birds, here with birds, particularly hawks and things of that nature, again, this is usually a non-lethal capture and translocation kind of issue. Because we don't mind them, right? They're not taking down livestock or anything, right? But there are certain cases where we need them to be somewhere else, right? And more often than not, when we talk about predator control with birds, it's because we've got two endangered species or two threatened species that are kind of bumping heads, right? And so all we got to do is get one of those species off to a different area where they can live and thrive and be happy, and the species that we don't move can live and thrive and be happy, and everybody's golden, right? Easier said than done, right? Absolutely easier said than done. And one of the problems here is that when we move animals, they have a not always super great chance of survival because it's a new area. They have to learn where the prey items are in that area. It's hard to find an unoccupied space for these new translocated animals. So again, it's not something we're really, really keen on doing if we don't have to. All right. Now, one thing that we're kind of always in danger of needing to consider is what is the actual effect of predators on prey populations? Are they limiting them or are they regulating them, right? Are we artificially holding down population sizes, or are we keeping them at or around K, right, at manageable population sizes? And there's lots of different hypotheses behind this. Recurrent fluctuations, the idea here is that prey densities fluctuate and they can change due to lots of outside factors, right? And so again, prey or predation does have an influence, but there's other things that are bigger kinds of reasons for the dips in our curve. Low density equilibria, basically the idea that there's density dependent predation occurring far below carrying capacity, right? So this is a case where predators are definitely limiting prey populations here. At this point, competition within the prey species is unimportant because we're not near carrying capacity. Something that's a little harder to understand, maybe not quite as clear, is this notion of multiple states, multiple state hypotheses. Here where we're suggesting that the prey is regulated at a relatively low density by predators, and at maybe high density, it's intraspecific competition. So if we have a population that's low density, right, here predator control might give us a big thing, right? They're keeping those population sizes small. If we're closer to K, right, predators aren't having that big of an effect, and really it's more competition between members of the prey species that's limiting population size. And then finally, stable limit cycles. Again, maybe not the, well, that's weird. The idea here is that, again, kind of like recurrent fluctuations, prey populations regularly just go up and down, up and down, up and down. Again, by predator control, by other outside factors, whatever. The one thing that's unique about all four of these, or consistent with all four of these, is that predation is a limiting factor. Okay, at least some part of the population size. It can be regulatory, right? It can be compensatory mortality, or it can be limiting, right? Again, depending on kind of where we're at. But it's not always easy to kind of figure out what has happened in places where humans have been around for a long time. So ultimately, and this is not the greatest answer in the world, but ultimately we need studies to figure out what predator control is actually doing. Is it actually meaningful, and in what circumstances is it meaningful? Right? We've talked about theoretical places where it could be useful, but there's little boots on the ground kind of data support any of that, right? And so it's a tricky thing, and ultimately predator control is not something that is well advised in most situations, just because we don't know. One other thing that makes life problematic is sort of the, how do I describe this? The nature of what controls an entire food chain or food web. Okay, so you can think of a food chain or a food web, right, as consisting of a lot of things kind of at the bottom, right? Your call them primary consumers, things that are eating plants and stuff like that, algae. And then above them, a series of different stages of animals that are consuming the animals below them, right? That's trophic structure. And in some cases, the way that the food web is constrained, the animals within it, the populations within it, is more governed by the animals at the top, and that's called top-down control. And sometimes it's more governed by the animals at the bottom, and it's called bottom-up. For top-down control, these sorts of top-down interactions, removing the predators at the top can be disastrous, right? So I think in your book, it's just generally a classic example of this. We look at near-shore marine ecosystems where we've got sea stars that eat a variety of different clams and mussels and things, and removing those sea stars actually ended up with a monoculture, so only one kind of clam in the area, because it was no longer being eaten by the sea stars above it, and so it outcompeted all of the other clams and mussels and things that were around drastically changing the population, right? All from just removing the sea stars. So there are lots of potential massive consequences from predator control, right? We're looking at it right now with Yellowstone. As we bring wolves back into Yellowstone, we're actively watching what's happening there. Again, as a situation where it's potentially another top-down control or another top-down interaction. And what that effect is going to have on different deer populations, on tree populations. Believe it or not, we're looking at the vegetation coming back in Yellowstone as a result of wolf reintroductions. Lots of very, very different things. But again, it's all very murky. It's all very cloudy. And so while this was originally like the method for management, is really often not a very good idea just because we don't know what's going to happen. And there are better ways of managing things that are maybe less potentially disastrous. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. We'll move on to our next chapter here in the next set of videos. And then that's the next chapter and then one more. So I think up to chapter 15. And then we will call it good there for the next exam.